Hey there, everyone. Before we drift into tonight's journey through history, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, settle into that perfect position you've been searching for all day, and let your shoulders drop just a little bit lower. Tonight, we're going to talk about something so mundane, so completely ordinary, that you've probably never questioned it in your entire life. We're going to talk about breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Or if you prefer, breakfast, dinner, and supper. The holy trinity of eating. The three pillars of your daily routine. The reason your stomach starts grumbling at very specific times of day, regardless of whether you're actually hungry. You see this whole 3 meals a day thing? It's medieval. Completely, utterly, undeniably medieval. And yet here we are, in the 21st century, organizing our entire lives around an eating schedule that was invented by people who thought bathing too frequently would let demons in through your pores. We've abandoned their medicine, scoffed at their politics, and rightfully rejected their approach to dental hygiene. But their meal schedule? That we keep, without question, without even really noticing. So tonight, as you lie there in the darkness, perhaps with your own dinner settling uncomfortably in your stomach, because you ate at exactly 6:30 like you do every single evening, we're going to explore why. Why 3 meals? Why these specific times? And why, despite everything we know about nutrition and metabolism and individual body chemistry, we still collectively agree that everyone should eat at roughly the same times, in roughly the same pattern, day after day after day. If you're enjoying this already, feel free to like the video, subscribe if you'd like more of these gentle wonders through history, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what you had for dinner tonight. I'm genuinely curious whether you ate it at your culture's designated dinner time, or whether you're one of those rebels who eats whenever you feel like it. Though I suspect, deep down, even the rebels among us are more scheduled than we'd like to admit. Let's begin with breakfast. The meal that medieval people were absolutely convinced would kill you. Medieval society had very strong opinions about breakfast. Specifically, the opinion that it was dangerous, gluttonous, and probably sinful. Now this seems odd to us, doesn't it? We've been told our entire lives that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. We've heard that skipping breakfast will slow our metabolism, ruin our concentration, and generally turn us into barely functional zombies stumbling through our morning routines. The cereal companies made very sure we understood this. The egg marketing boards backed them up. Breakfast, we learned, was sacred. Medieval monks, however, would have found this hilarious, or perhaps horrifying. Probably both. You see, in medieval religious communities, eating before midday was considered a sign of weakness. It suggested you couldn't control your bodily appetites. It hinted that you were more interested in physical comfort than spiritual discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed monastic life across much of medieval Europe, was quite clear on this point. 1 meal a day was the standard. Perhaps 2 if you were feeling particularly fragile or if it was a feast day. But eating in the morning? Before you'd even properly praise God for allowing you to wake up at all? That was self-indulgent at best and potentially damning at worst. The logic, such as it was, went something like this. Nighttime was for sleeping. Morning was for prayer. Midday was when you'd finally proven your devotion sufficiently to deserve food. The very word breakfast, when it eventually emerged in Middle English, literally meant breaking your fast. And that fast was supposed to last from dinner the previous day until midday the next. That's roughly 18 hours, give or take. Every single day. Not as a diet plan, not as a health trend. As a basic expectation of decent behavior. Now, monks were extreme, certainly. They were supposed to be extreme. That was rather the point of becoming a monk. But their attitudes about morning eating filtered down through the rest of medieval society in fascinating ways. Medical texts from the period warned that eating too early in the day would cause an imbalance in your humors. Remember humors? Those four bodily fluids that medieval physicians were absolutely convinced controlled everything about your health and personality. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. All needing to be kept in perfect balance, or else you'd end up melancholic or choleric or some other condition that basically meant your personality was inconvenient to everyone around you. According to medieval medical wisdom, your body needed time after waking to properly adjust to being conscious again. Your digestive system, they believed, was essentially asleep along with the rest of you. Throwing food at it first thing in the morning was like trying to start a cart by hitting the horse before it had fully stood up. Inconsiderate to your internal organs. Likely to cause problems. Best to wait until the sun had risen properly and your body had remembered it was supposed to be alive. This wasn't just theory, mind you. This was practical advice that physicians would give to their patients. Don't eat breakfast, wait until dinner. Your body will thank you. And people listened, at least those who could afford to have physicians telling them things in the first place. The wealthy, the educated, the respectable members of medieval society, they all nodded along and agreed that yes, breakfast was suspicious at best. Of course, what people said and what people actually did were often two entirely different things, which is just as true in the Middle Ages as it is now. While medical texts condemned breakfast and religious rules forbade it, actual medieval people were quietly eating breakfast anyway. They just didn't call it breakfast. They called it something else. A small bite, a light refreshment, a piece of bread taken for purely medicinal purposes because they felt faint. Certainly not a meal, definitely not gluttonous. Just a pragmatic acknowledgement that farm work and manual labor are rather difficult on an empty stomach that hasn't been fed for nearly 20 hours. Peasants, as usual, had a more practical relationship with food than their supposed betters. When you wake up before dawn to work in the fields, and you know you won't be eating a proper meal until midday, you eat something. Bread, likely. Cheese if you're fortunate. Perhaps some leftover pottage from the night before. Cold and congealed, but still technically food. You eat it quickly, probably while standing up, possibly while walking toward your first task of the day. And you certainly don't make a big production of it, because technically you're not supposed to be doing this at all. The upper classes had a different workaround. They simply stayed in bed longer. If you don't wake up until mid-morning, you haven't really skipped breakfast. You've just merged it with dinner through the clever application of oversleeping. This had the added benefit of making you look appropriately refined and leisurely. As if you were so spiritually evolved that your body naturally didn't demand food until the proper time. Never mind that you'd probably had your servants bring you some bread and ale in your chambers while you were getting dressed. That didn't count. That was just fortification for the day ahead. Children, the sick, and the elderly were generally exempt from the no breakfast rule. This makes sense in a way. Children need to eat more frequently because they're growing. The sick need nourishment to recover. The elderly have earned the right to eat whenever they jolly well please, and if you suggest otherwise, they'll probably hit you with their walking stick. These exceptions were well understood and socially acceptable. But if you were a healthy adult, particularly a healthy adult man, eating breakfast was admitting weakness. It was saying out loud to everyone around you that you couldn't make it until dinner without food. How embarrassing. How disappointing. How suspiciously close to gluttony. And yet, despite all this social pressure and medical warnings and religious prohibitions, breakfast slowly, gradually began to creep into acceptability. It took centuries. It happened so gradually that no one really noticed it was happening. But by the end of the medieval period, breakfast was becoming more common, more acknowledged, more openly discussed. People stopped pretending they weren't eating in the morning. They started, tentatively, to call it breakfast. The word itself started appearing in documents and literature without the apologetic tone that had previously accompanied it. Why did this happen? Partly because work patterns were changing. As cities grew and commerce expanded, people needed to be functional earlier in the day. Merchants needed to be at market by dawn. Craftsmen needed to start their work before the best light of day was wasted. And all these people needed energy to do these things, which meant they needed food. Practical concerns, as they so often do, won out over spiritual ideals. Partly it was because breakfast foods were becoming more available and more affordable. Bread, the medieval breakfast staple, was increasingly cheap and accessible. Urban bakeries made it possible to buy fresh bread every morning rather than having to bake it yourself. Ale, another breakfast favorite. Yes, people drank ale for breakfast. We'll get to that shortly. Was widely available and safer to drink than water in most medieval towns. When food is cheap and convenient, people eat it, regardless of what the monks say about it. And partly it was just exhaustion. Medieval people were tired of being told not to eat breakfast. They were tired of pretending they didn't want it. They were tired of the moral weight attached to something as simple as eating some bread in the morning. So they started eating breakfast openly. And the world did not end. Their humors remained balanced. God did not strike them down for their gluttony. Life continued, just with slightly fuller stomachs, in the morning. By the time we reach the early modern period, breakfast is fully established. It's normal, expected. No one is questioning it anymore, though there are still debates about what constitutes an appropriate breakfast versus an excessive one. And from there, it's a straight line to our modern world, where breakfast is so entrenched, so normalized, so completely unquestioned that we've built entire industries around it. Cereal companies, egg producers, pancake houses, all of them depending on this medieval assumption that there should be a meal in the morning, that it should happen at roughly the same time every day, and that there's something wrong with you if you skip it. Which brings us to a curious modern parallel. Today, we have intermittent fasting. We have people deliberately skipping breakfast, claiming health benefits, improved mental clarity, better weight management. And what do we call this practice? Fasting. We've come full circle. Medieval monks would be nodding in approval, though they'd probably be baffled by the fact that we're doing it for our waistlines rather than our souls. We're following their eating patterns, just with different motivations. They skipped breakfast for God. We skip breakfast for our metabolism. The meal schedule, however, remains eerily similar. But breakfast is just the beginning of this story. Because once medieval society decided there should be a morning meal, they had to figure out when the midday meal should happen. And that's where things get really interesting, in that uniquely medieval way where interesting means completely arbitrary but enforced with surprising rigidity. Dinner, the main meal of the medieval day. Not the evening meal, mind you. The midday meal. Because in medieval society, dinner happened in the middle of the day, generally sometime between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, depending on the season, your social class, and how hungry everyone was getting. This timing wasn't random. It was carefully calculated based on when people had been awake long enough to deserve food, but not so long that they'd collapse from hunger. Remember, most people weren't eating breakfast, or at least weren't admitting to eating breakfast. So, by 11 in the morning, they'd been awake for somewhere between 5 and 7 hours, depending on the season and their occupation. They'd done a considerable amount of work. They'd prayed if they were religiously inclined, or at least they'd thought vaguely guilty thoughts about not praying if they weren't. They were, by any reasonable measure, ready to eat. The timing of dinner was also influenced by practical concerns, particularly light. Candles were expensive. Rush lights were smelly and provided terrible illumination. Tallow candles were even worse, producing more smoke than light and filling your house with the delightful aroma of burned animal fat. So if you wanted to eat, while being able to see your food, you ate during daylight. And if you were having your main meal, you wanted good light for it, which meant midday, when the sun was highest and brightest. This created an interesting dynamic in medieval households. The entire day was structured around dinner. Morning was pre-dinner time. Afternoon was post-dinner time. Dinner was the anchor point, the fixed star, around which everything else orbited. You worked in the morning with the understanding that dinner was coming. You rested in the afternoon because dinner had already happened. The meal wasn't just about food. It was about structure, rhythm, a way of organizing time in a world that didn't have reliable clocks. Actually, let's pause here for a moment to appreciate just how strange medieval timekeeping was. We think of time as precise, measurable, divided into neat 60-minute hours that are exactly the same length regardless of the season or weather. Medieval people thought of time as flexible, approximate, divided into hours that changed length depending on how much daylight there was. In summer, daylight hours were longer, so each hour of the day was longer. In winter, daylight hours were shorter, so each hour of the day was shorter. This made perfect sense to medieval people, because why would you want hours to be the same length when daylight wasn't the same length? That would be ridiculous. This system of temporal hours, as they're called, meant that dinner time was technically at the 6th hour of the day. But the 6th hour in June was a different length than the 6th hour in December, which meant dinner happened at different times, depending on the season, and no one found this confusing at all. Well, no, that's not true. Everyone found it confusing. But they all found it confusing in the same way, so it evened out. Monks naturally had tried to impose order on this chaos. Monastic communities divided the day into 7 prayer times from matins in the middle of the night through compline in the evening. These prayers happened at fixed intervals. Though what constituted a fixed interval in a world without accurate clocks is debatable. The 6th-hour prayer, sext, generally fell around midday, and this is where the word noon comes from. Noon was when you prayed sext, and also, conveniently, when you might be allowed to eat your first meal of the day. For the broader medieval population, dinner time was announced by church bells. Churches were the medieval equivalent of public timekeeping devices. The bells rang to mark prayers, yes, but they also rang to mark the hours of the day, at least approximately. When the bells rang for sext, you knew it was roughly dinner time. Close enough anyway. So you stopped what you were doing, cleaned your hands if you were feeling particularly refined that day, and gathered for dinner. What did medieval people eat for dinner? Well, that depended rather dramatically on whether you were rich or poor, which is true of just about everything in medieval society, but is especially stark when it comes to food. Wealthy people ate elaborate meals with multiple courses. Meat, which was expensive. Poultry, fish, white bread, which was much more costly than brown bread. Spices imported at great expense from exotic locations and used in quantities that would make modern people weep. Wine, if you were particularly well off, or lived somewhere wine was produced locally. Peasants ate pottage, a thick stew made from whatever was available. Grains, vegetables. Occasionally a bit of meat if something had died or you'd successfully caught something. Bread, usually brown bread, made from mixed grains rather than the refined wheat flour the wealthy preferred. Ale, because water was often unsafe to drink, and ale was both safer and more caloric, which mattered when you were doing heavy physical labor all day. Cheese, if you had it. Butter, if you were fortunate. The entire meal would be served in one large bowl or pot, with everyone eating from the same vessel using bread as edible plates. But regardless of what you ate, dinner was the main event, the big meal, the one where you actually felt full afterward, or at least as full as you were going to feel. You ate slowly because eating quickly was considered rude, and because the food wasn't going anywhere. You ate with others, because eating alone was suspicious and possibly sinful. You talked while you ate, though hopefully not with your mouth full, because table manners were starting to become a thing among the upper classes, and they were very concerned with making sure everyone knew the proper way to eat. This is where we start seeing the emergence of dining etiquette, that wonderful set of arbitrary rules about how to behave at meals that serves no functional purpose whatsoever, but makes everyone feel sophisticated. Don't eat with your hands, use the bread trencher. Don't reach across the table, ask someone to pass things. Don't wipe your mouth on the tablecloth, use your napkin. Assuming you're wealthy enough to have a napkin. Don't throw bones on the floor. Throw them in the bone dish. Actually, no, it was fine to throw bones on the floor. That's what the dogs were for. Honestly, medieval table manners were a confusing mess of contradictions that varied by region, social class, and who was watching. But the timing of dinner? That was consistent. Midday. Every single day. It became so ingrained that people's stomachs learned to expect it. Their bodies started demanding food at roughly the same time each day, which medieval people took as proof that this was the natural, correct time to eat dinner. It never occurred to them that their bodies had simply learned a pattern and were now enforcing it through hunger pangs. No, clearly God designed humans to be hungry at midday. This was the proper order of things. And then came supper, which was supposed to be a light evening meal, but which medieval people seem to have had trouble keeping light. Supper, in medieval theory, was not supposed to be a big deal. It was supposed to be a small meal eaten in the evening, something to tide you over until breakfast the next day. Except you weren't eating breakfast, so actually it was supposed to tide you over until dinner the next day, which was a very long time to go without food. This presented certain practical difficulties. The word supper comes from échoppe, which refers to bread soaked in liquid. The original idea was that supper would literally be some bread dunked in wine or broth, eaten quickly, without much ceremony. A functional meal, a practical meal, certainly not an indulgent meal. Just enough to quiet your stomach so you could sleep without being kept awake by hunger. This sounds reasonable enough until you remember that dinner might have been 7 or 8 hours ago, and you've been working since then. And you're hungry, really hungry. Stomach growling, hard to think about anything else hungry. So, while the plan was to have a small light supper, the reality was often rather different. Wealthy households, predictably, turned supper into another elaborate affair. Multiple dishes, more meat, more wine, more of everything, really. Because when you have resources, you tend to use them, regardless of what some monk wrote about appropriate portion sizes. These weren't quite as extravagant as dinner, at least not officially. Dinner was still the main meal. Supper was just a secondary main meal. The distinction was important to medieval people, even if it wouldn't be particularly obvious to anyone actually watching them eat. For peasants and working people, supper was more genuinely small, mainly because they didn't have the resources for it to be anything else. More bread, more pottage, possibly what was left over from dinner, reheated if they had the fuel to spare. Ale, cheese. Whatever vegetables were in season and hadn't been eaten at dinner. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't particularly filling. But it was food, which mattered when the alternative was going to bed hungry. The timing of supper was less fixed than dinner. It depended on when sunset was, which varied by season. It depended on when work ended for the day. It depended on when people were actually hungry enough to want to eat again. Generally, supper happened somewhere between 5 and 8 in the evening, earlier in winter when darkness came early, later in summer when there were more daylight hours to fill. But it happened. Every day. A third meal. Not quite official, not quite as important as dinner, but present nonetheless. And this is where we arrive at our modern paradox. Somewhere between the medieval period and now, dinner and supper switched places. Dinner, which was the midday meal, became the evening meal. Supper, which was the evening meal, either disappeared entirely or became a light snack before bed, depending on your regional terminology. Lunch appeared out of nowhere to fill the gap left by dinner's migration to evening. How did this happen? When did this happen? The answers are complicated and gradual and involve the Industrial Revolution, artificial lighting, changing work patterns, and the slow, grinding transformation of society from agricultural to industrial. But the short version is this. People started working different hours, in different locations, doing different types of labor, and the medieval meal schedule simply couldn't adapt. Factory workers couldn't go home for dinner at midday. Office workers couldn't take several hours off in the middle of the day to eat a large meal. Urban dwellers living in cramped quarters couldn't prepare elaborate midday meals, even if they had time to eat them. So dinner moved. It migrated to evening when people were actually home, when they had time to prepare and eat a substantial meal, when the day's work was finished and they could relax. Midday still needed something, though. People still got hungry. They still needed fuel. So lunch appeared. A lighter meal than dinner had been, but more substantial than breakfast. Something you could eat relatively quickly, without going home, possibly without even sitting down. Sandwiches became popular, pies, portable foods that could be eaten at or near your workplace. The midday meal became utilitarian rather than social, functional rather than ceremonious. A refueling stop rather than a destination. And yet, and here's the fascinating bit, we kept the pattern. 3 meals. Morning, midday, evening. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. The specific foods changed. The locations changed. The time shifted. The names shuffled around. But the basic structure remained identical to the medieval model. 3 meals a day. Eat them at approximately the same times. Space them relatively evenly throughout your waking hours. Don't skip meals or you'll feel guilty and probably get hungry. We've modernized the packaging, but the product is medieval through and through. Let's talk about the tyranny of mealtimes. Because that's what they are, really. A tyranny. A set of social expectations so deeply ingrained that violating them feels wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. You're not supposed to eat breakfast at 3 in the afternoon, even if that's when you're hungry. You're not supposed to eat dinner at 10 in the morning, even if you woke up at 3 and have been awake for 7 hours. You're not supposed to skip lunch, even if you're not hungry. And you're definitely not supposed to eat whenever you want, following your body's actual hunger signals, because that would be chaotic, disorganized, suspicious. We've taken this medieval framework and built our entire society around it. Schools serve lunch at the same time every day, regardless of whether all the children are actually hungry at that time. Businesses schedule lunch breaks assuming everyone wants to eat at noon or 1 o'clock. Restaurants staff up during designated mealtimes and have skeleton crews the rest of the day. Social invitations specify dinner time, and arriving significantly before or after is considered rude. We've made the meal schedule into a social coordination mechanism, a way of synchronizing our activities with everyone else's. And it works, largely. Having everyone eat at roughly the same times makes planning easier, socializing easier, organizing families and workplaces easier. But it's worth noticing that none of this is natural. None of this is based on human biology or nutritional science. It's based on medieval monastic schedules and pre-industrial work patterns and the gradual accretion of social norms over centuries. Your body doesn't actually know what time it is. It can learn patterns, certainly. It can start producing digestive enzymes at times when you regularly eat, anticipating food. But that's learned behavior, not innate biology. If you ate at completely random times, your body would adapt. You'd get hungry when you hadn't eaten in a while, not when the clock said it was lunchtime. You would eat when you were actually hungry. Not because it was 6 o'clock and therefore dinner must happen now. But we don't do that. We eat by the clock. We eat by social convention. We eat according to a schedule invented by medieval monks who were trying to prove their spiritual devotion through self-denial, and then modified by industrial factory owners who needed workers back at their stations at predictable times, and then further refined by modern productivity culture that treats meals as brief, scheduled interruptions to what you're really supposed to be doing, which is working. Is this a problem? Not necessarily. Mealtimes do provide structure. They do make planning easier. They do help families and communities coordinate. But it's odd, isn't it? That we follow this pattern so faithfully, that we rarely question it, that suggesting people should eat whenever they're hungry, as much as they're hungry, without reference to some externally imposed schedule, sounds radical, almost rebellious, certainly impractical. Medieval people would understand this perfectly. They also ate according to social expectations rather than hunger. They also had elaborate justifications for why their meal schedule was the correct and natural one. They also rarely questioned the system, because questioning it would have been odd and possibly heretical. The specific justifications have changed. We talk about metabolism and productivity rather than humors and spirituality. But the underlying pattern persists. And this pattern extends beyond just when we eat. It affects what we eat, how much we eat, how we think about food and hunger and appropriate eating behavior. We've inherited an entire complex of assumptions and expectations, all of them medieval in origin, all of them still quietly governing our behavior centuries later. Let's consider breakfast foods. Since we're on the subject, why do we have specific foods that are considered appropriate for breakfast? Why is it normal to eat eggs and bacon in the morning, but strange to eat pizza? Both are food. Both provide calories and nutrients. But one is breakfast food, and the other isn't. And everyone just knows this, even though no one ever explicitly taught us. This too is medieval, though the specific foods have changed. Medieval breakfast, when people admitted to eating it, consisted of bread and ale. Possibly some cheese. Maybe some dried fish if you live near the coast. These were breakfast foods, not because they had some special breakfast-appropriate quality, but because they were convenient, easy to prepare. Didn't require cooking, could be eaten quickly. Over time, this category of breakfast foods evolved. Porridge became popular, eggs became common, bacon appeared. Coffee and tea replaced ale, though it took a while for people to stop finding this substitution deeply suspicious. But the concept remained. Certain foods are for breakfast, other foods are not, and mixing them up is weird. Why do we still have this distinction? Nutritionally, there's no reason why eggs are better to eat in the morning than, say, soup. Culturally, though, eggs are breakfast food. Soup is lunch or dinner food. Eating soup for breakfast would be unusual. Not wrong exactly, just unusual. The sort of thing you might do if you were sick or eccentric or possibly both. The 3 meals a day schedule came with 3 distinct categories of food. And we've maintained those categories even as the specific foods within them have changed. Breakfast foods are quick and simple. Lunch foods are portable, or at least quick to prepare. Dinner foods are elaborate and require cooking. These categories made sense in a medieval context. They make less sense now, when refrigeration and global food distribution mean you can have any food at any time. But we keep them anyway, because that's what we've always done. And changing would be weird. The question we should be asking, but rarely do, is whether any of this serves us well. Does eating 3 times a day at approximately the same times each day actually benefit us? Or are we just following a pattern because it's familiar? Nutritional science suggests that the answer is complicated. Some people do well eating 3 meals a day. Others do better with 5 or 6 smaller meals. Still others thrive on intermittent fasting, eating once or twice a day. There's no universal optimal meal schedule because human bodies are variable and respond differently to different eating patterns. But we've built our entire food culture around this 3 meals assumption. Restaurants are designed for it. Grocery stores stock food for it. Diet advice assumes it. We talk about balanced breakfasts and well-rounded dinners and proper lunch portions, all predicated on the idea that everyone should be eating 3 meals at roughly the same times every single day. And if you don't, if you skip breakfast regularly, or eat dinner at midnight, or graze throughout the day, rather than having discrete meals, you're weird, an outlier, probably unhealthy. Definitely not following the proper schedule. The schedule that everyone else follows. The schedule that we inherited from medieval monks and have never seriously reconsidered despite living in a completely different world with completely different needs. This is what I mean by medieval rules we still follow for no reason. It's not that having meal times is inherently bad. It's that we follow this particular meal schedule, not because it's optimal or natural or particularly well suited to modern life, but because it's what we inherited. We've dressed it up in modern language, surrounded it with nutritional science and productivity research, but underneath, it's still fundamentally medieval. 3 meals? Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Same times, every day. Don't question it. Don't deviate. This is how eating works. Let me tell you about a peasant named Geoffrey who lived in a small village in 14th century England. Geoffrey wasn't real exactly. Or rather, he was probably real in the sense that someone with roughly his life existed. But I'm reconstructing him from historical records and making informed guesses about his daily life. Bear with me. This is going somewhere. Geoffrey woke up around 5 in the morning in summer. Earlier in winter, when there was more work to do by a limited daylight. He did not eat breakfast because breakfast wasn't a thing peasants admitted to eating. He went directly to the fields, where he worked on his lord's land because that was his obligation. He worked for 3 or 4 hours, maybe 5. He got hungry, very hungry. His stomach cramped. He felt lightheaded. But dinner wasn't until midday. So he kept working, because that's what you did. When the church bells finally rang for sext, Geoffrey stopped work and went home. Home was a one-room cottage he shared with his wife, 3 children, a pig, and varying numbers of chickens. His wife had been preparing dinner while he worked. Pottage, as usual. Thick with grain and vegetables. Thin on meat, because meat was expensive, and they only had it on special occasions. They all ate from the same pot, using bread as spoons. The children complained that they were still hungry after, but there wasn't more food, so they stopped complaining fairly quickly. Geoffrey returned to work in the fields. He worked until the light started failing, sometime between 4 and 7 depending on the season. He went home again. Supper was more bread, more of the pottage from dinner, warmed up if there was enough fuel. The children ate first, then the adults. By the time everyone was fed, it was dark. Geoffrey and his family went to bed, because there wasn't much else to do in the dark, and candles were expensive. This was every day, for his entire life. 3 meals, or arguably 2.5 meals. Same times, same foods, mostly. Same rhythm, day after day, year after year. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't particularly healthy by modern standards. But it was what everyone did. So it seemed normal, natural, the correct way to organize eating. Now imagine Geoffrey transported to modern times. Imagine him walking into a modern kitchen with a refrigerator full of food, a pantry stocked with snacks, a cupboard full of instant meals. Imagine trying to explain to him that we still, basically, follow his eating schedule, that we eat 3 times a day at approximately the times he did, just with better food and more of it. He'd be baffled. Why? He'd ask. You have all this food. You have ways to keep it from spoiling. You can cook at any time with just the flip of a switch. Why are you eating like a medieval peasant? And what would we answer? Because it's healthy? The nutritional science doesn't actually support that for everyone. Because it's convenient? It's actually often inconvenient, forcing us to eat when we're not hungry or skip meals when we are. Because it's traditional. That's the real answer, isn't it? Because it's traditional. Because this is what we've always done. Because changing would be weird. Jeffrey would probably shrug and help himself to the refrigerator, eating whenever he wanted. Because medieval peasants didn't actually want to follow the meal schedule either. They just didn't have a choice. We have a choice. We have abundance and technology and flexibility that Jeffrey couldn't even imagine. And we're using all of that to faithfully recreate his eating schedule. Let's talk about meal times and social control, because that's what this is really about. Medieval meal times weren't just about food. They were about discipline, structure, maintaining order. The same impulse that made monks pray at fixed hours made everyone eat at fixed times. It's about synchronization. About everyone doing the same thing at the same time, which makes them predictable, which makes them manageable. Monastic life was particularly explicit about this. The rule of St. Benedict didn't just say when to eat. It said how to eat. In silence, while someone read aloud from religious texts, slowly with gratitude, never to excess, never for pleasure. Eating was reframed as a spiritual discipline rather than a physical necessity. The meal schedule was part of a broader system of control, a way of shaping behavior through routine. This impulse filtered into broader medieval society. Lords wanted their labourers working predictable hours. The church wanted everyone attending services at predictable times. Communities wanted everyone following roughly the same daily rhythm because it made social coordination easier. Mealtimes became part of this synchronization. Everyone eating at roughly the same times meant everyone was available for work or prayer or community obligations at predictable intervals. We've secularized this impulse, but we haven't abandoned it. Modern work schedules are built around mealtimes. You're expected to be available from 9 to 5, with an hour for lunch. Not because this schedule is optimal for productivity. Research suggests it often isn't. But because it's predictable. It allows coordination. It means everyone is present at the same times, eating at the same times, available at the same times. Schools are even more explicit about this. Children eat lunch at assigned times, in assigned locations, often with assigned seats. They are given a fixed amount of time to eat, usually not enough. They can't eat when they're hungry. They eat when the schedule says they should eat. This is framed as practical necessity, and to some extent it is. You can't have 500 children eating whenever they feel like it. But it's also training. It's teaching children that their physical needs are secondary to the schedule. That hunger doesn't matter if it's not lunchtime yet. That eating is something you do at designated times, not in response to your body's signals. By the time these children are adults, they've internalized this so completely that they don't even notice it anymore. Of course you eat at meal times. Of course you wait until lunch to eat, even if you're hungry at 10. Of course you eat dinner at 6, even if you're not particularly hungry yet. This is just how eating works. The schedule is more important than the hunger. And this is useful for organizing society, certainly. But it's worth asking. Useful for whom? Who benefits from everyone eating at the same times? Not the people eating, necessarily. Many of us would probably prefer to eat when we're actually hungry. But employers benefit because it means workers are predictably available. Restaurants benefit because it means customers arrive in predictable waves. Food manufacturers benefit because it means consistent demand for breakfast foods, lunch foods, dinner foods. The 3 meals a day schedule isn't natural law. It's social engineering. It's a coordination mechanism. It's a way of synchronizing human behavior to make society more predictable and manageable. We've been doing it for so long that it seems natural, but it's not. It's a choice. Or rather, it was a choice. Made centuries ago by people with very different priorities than we have now. We're just living with the consequences. There's a certain comfort in routine, though. In knowing when meals will happen. In having that structure, that rhythm to the day. Even if the schedule is arbitrary, even if it doesn't align perfectly with our actual hunger or our actual nutritional needs, it provides predictability. And humans generally like predictability. We like knowing what to expect. We like patterns. We like being able to plan our day around fixed points, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Perhaps that's why we keep this medieval schedule, despite having no practical need for it anymore. Not because we've consciously decided it's the optimal way to eat, but because it's familiar, comfortable, the way things have always been done, at least within living memory. Changing would require thought and effort, and a willingness to seem strange. Easier to just keep eating breakfast at breakfast time, lunch at lunchtime, dinner at dinner time, the same way everyone else does. Medieval people would understand this completely. They also kept traditions not because they were optimal, but because they were traditional. They also followed patterns because changing them seemed unnecessarily difficult. They also did things the way they'd always been done simply because that's how they'd always been done. We mock medieval people for their superstitions and their rigid thinking, but in this, we're exactly like them. We just have different rationalizations for our rigidity. If you're still awake, which you might be, or you might be drifting into that pleasant space between waking and sleeping, where you're sort of listening, but also sort of dreaming. Let me ask you something. Tomorrow, when you eat breakfast or lunch or dinner, whenever your next meal is, take a moment to notice the time. Notice whether you're actually hungry or whether you're eating because it's mealtime. Notice whether you could skip the meal if you wanted to, or whether the thought of doing so makes you uncomfortable. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to start eating on some radical new schedule or abandon the 3 meals a day pattern. But maybe just notice it. Notice this medieval framework you're living in, this schedule you've inherited from monks and peasants and people who thought bathing was dangerous. Notice how completely it governs your day, despite you never consciously choosing it. And then eat your meal. Whatever it is, whenever it is, because whether or not the schedule makes sense, you still need to eat. That much, at least, hasn't changed since the Middle Ages. People need food. we've just made the timing of that food unnecessarily complicated. Here's another interesting thing about medieval meals that we've preserved, though we've made it more subtle. The idea that different types of people should eat different foods at different times. Medieval society was extremely hierarchical, and this extended to food. What you ate, how much you ate, and when you ate all signaled your social status. Nobles ate white bread. Peasants ate brown bread. Nobles ate meat regularly. Peasants ate meat occasionally, if at all. Nobles had spiced, elaborate dishes. Peasants had pottage. These weren't just economic differences, though economics certainly played a role. They were social markers. Eating the wrong food for your station was inappropriate, even if you could somehow afford it. We've abandoned the explicit class-based food restrictions, obviously. Anyone with money can eat white bread now, which medieval nobles would find deeply offensive. But we've kept the underlying principle that different types of meals signal different things. A business lunch is different from a family dinner. A working lunch is different from a leisure lunch. Breakfast is casual. Dinner is formal, or at least more formal than breakfast. We dress differently for different meals. We use different dishes, different settings, different levels of etiquette. These distinctions are arbitrary. Food is food. A sandwich is the same nutritional item whether you eat it at a business meeting or at home on your couch. But we've maintained these social categories, these ways of using meals to signal status and context and appropriate behavior. It's medieval thinking in modern clothing. Let's talk about family dinners, since we're on the subject of dinner as social institution. The idea of the family gathering for dinner is deeply medieval. In medieval households, both rich and poor, dinner was when the household came together. The lord and lady sat at the high table with important guests. Lower-ranking members of the household sat at lower tables, arranged by status. Servants ate separately, either before or after. But everyone ate, and the timing was coordinated to reinforce the household hierarchy. For peasant families, dinner was simpler, but served the same function. Everyone stopped work. Everyone came home. Everyone ate together from the same pot. This wasn't about quality family time or meaningful conversation. It was about household unity, about reinforcing that you were part of this unit, this family, this community. Eating together meant you belonged. We've kept this idea. The family dinner is still held up as important, valuable, something we should do regularly, even though modern schedules make it difficult. We worry when families stop eating together. We see it as a sign of breakdown, of fragmentation, and there's research supporting this concern. Families that eat together do tend to communicate better, to be closer, but the specific mechanism by which this happens is interesting. Eating together forces presence. You have to stop what you're doing and be in the same place at the same time as everyone else. In a world where everyone has different schedules and different activities and different digital devices, having a mandatory gathering point matters. The food is almost secondary. What matters is the gathering, the synchronized activity, the shared time. This is precisely what medieval family dinners did, just without the mobile phones. Everyone stopped their individual work and came together. The meal was the excuse and the mechanism, but the real function was synchronization. Making sure the household maintained cohesion despite everyone having different tasks and responsibilities. We've preserved this function, even as the context has changed completely. Medieval families needed to eat together because they were economic production units that required coordination. Modern families need to eat together because we're worried about disconnection and lack of communication. Different problem, same solution. Gather for dinner, eat at the same time. Use the meal as an anchor point for family cohesion. The timing of modern dinner, evening after work, creates interesting dynamics that medieval people would find strange. For them, dinner was midday. During work, you took a break, ate, then returned to work. Supper was after work, but supper was light and informal. The main meal happened in the middle of the day. We've inverted this. Our main meal happens at the end of the day, after work is finished. This means dinner has become the separation point between work and leisure, between productive time and personal time. You don't just eat dinner, you have dinner. It's an event, a transition, the marking of the day's end. This gives a dinner an emotional weight that medieval dinner didn't have. Medieval dinner was just a meal, admittedly the main meal, but still fundamentally about eating food. Modern dinner is about more than food. It's about family, about relaxation, about reward. You've worked all day. Now you get to eat a nice meal. You've been productive. Now you get to enjoy yourself. Dinner is permission to stop working. This adds pressure to dinner that medieval people would find bewildering. Dinner has to be good. It has to be enjoyable. It has to live up to its role as the reward for getting through the day. If dinner is disappointing, the whole day feels disappointing. Medieval people didn't expect this from their meals. They expected sustenance. Anything beyond that was bonus. But we expect dinner to be satisfying in multiple dimensions. Nutritionally, socially, emotionally. It's a lot of weight to put on a meal. Breakfast has developed its own strange mythology in modern times. We're told it's the most important meal of the day, that skipping it will harm our metabolism, that we need it to function properly. None of this is particularly supported by science. Some people do well eating breakfast, others don't. Individual variation is high. But we have this cultural conviction that breakfast is essential, and people who skip it regularly are doing something wrong. This is almost funny when you remember that medieval people thought breakfast was sinful. We've completely inverted the moral valence while keeping the moral judgment. Then, eating breakfast meant you lacked self-control. Now, skipping breakfast means you lack self-care. Different era, different reasoning, same certainty that there's a correct way to handle breakfast, and people who deviate from it are suspect. The breakfast cereal industry deserves some credit or blame for this shift. They ran extensive advertising campaigns in the early 20th century, promoting breakfast as essential. They funded nutrition research that conveniently concluded breakfast was important. They created a cultural narrative around breakfast that served their commercial interests. And it worked. Breakfast became entrenched as a necessary meal, and an entire industry grew up around providing breakfast foods. Medieval monks would have been horrified by this development, not because of the commercial manipulation. They understood commercial manipulation perfectly well, thank you. But because of the celebration of breakfast as virtue. They spent centuries trying to convince people not to eat breakfast, and here we are, centuries later, insisting that everyone must eat breakfast. Their spiritual discipline has become our nutritional common sense, except inverted. We've kept the rigidity while reversing the content. Lunch is the odd meal out in this trio. Breakfast and dinner have strong cultural significance. Breakfast sets the tone for the day. Dinner marks its end. Lunch is just lunch. It's functional. Utilitarian. The meal you eat at work, possibly while working. The meal you don't spend much time thinking about, unless it's disappointing. This makes sense when you remember that lunch is the newcomer. Breakfast and dinner have medieval pedigrees. Lunch appeared later, filling the gap left when dinner migrated to evening. It was never meant to be important. It was meant to be expedient, a quick refueling so you could continue working. And that's largely what it remains. There are exceptions, of course. Business lunches turn the meal into a work activity. Sunday lunches in some cultures are elaborate family affairs. But for the most part, lunch is the meal we think about least, care about least, and invest the least effort into. It's the meal we eat because it's lunchtime and we're supposed to eat lunch, not because we're particularly excited about it. Medieval people would understand this completely. Supper, the light evening meal, served the same function. It was necessary but not celebrated. You ate it because you needed to eat something before the long gap, until dinner the next day, not because supper itself was important. Lunch is our supper, just relocated to midday. The thankless necessary meal that keeps the whole schedule functioning, but receives little appreciation. Let me tell you about circadian rhythms, because they're relevant here. Your body has an internal clock that regulates all sorts of processes, including when you feel hungry. This clock is influenced by external cues like light and, significantly, eating times. If you eat at the same times every day, your body learns this pattern and starts preparing for food at those times. Your digestive system ramps up enzyme production. Your metabolism shifts. You feel hungry. This is often presented as evidence that eating at fixed times is natural and good. Your body knows when meal times are. It's expecting food. You should eat. But what's actually happening is that your body has learned a pattern and is following it. If you changed your eating times, your body would adapt to the new pattern. If you ate randomly, with no fixed schedule, your body would still get hungry, just based on how long it's been since you last ate, rather than what time the clock says. The meal schedule isn't natural, it's learned. Your body is incredibly adaptable and will work with whatever pattern you give it. The 3 meals a day schedule feels natural because we've trained ourselves to follow it from childhood, not because it's biologically optimal. We've turned medieval monastic discipline into a physiological pattern. And then we've claimed that the pattern proves the schedule was right all along. It's circular reasoning. We eat at these times, so our bodies expect food at these times, so we should eat at these times. But the initial decision to eat at these specific times was arbitrary, based on medieval work patterns and religious practices that have no relevance to modern life. We're following our bodies, which are following a schedule we imposed on them, which was based on medieval assumptions we inherited without questioning. There's something poignant about all this, in a way. Medieval people didn't have much control over their lives. Their mealtimes were dictated by their lords, by the church, by practical constraints like daylight and fuel availability. They ate when they could eat, within the limited options available to them. The 3-meal schedule wasn't chosen for its health benefits or its convenience. It was imposed by circumstance and enforced by social pressure. We have none of these constraints now. We have refrigeration, artificial lighting, diverse food sources, flexible work arrangements. We could eat whenever we wanted, however many times we wanted. We have a freedom that medieval people couldn't even imagine. And we're using that freedom to carefully, faithfully recreate their meal schedule. This isn't necessarily bad. Structure has value. Routine has value. Shared social conventions have value. But it's odd, this careful preservation of a medieval framework, despite having no practical need for it. We've modernized everything else. Our work is different. Our leisure is different. Our technology is different. But our meal schedule? That's medieval. Still. After all these centuries, perhaps it's because food is fundamental. We all need to eat, regardless of what century we live in. And having a shared understanding of when and how eating happens makes social coordination easier. So we keep the pattern, update the specific foods and locations and justifications, but maintain the basic structure because changing it would be too disruptive. Or perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps we keep eating 3 meals a day at fixed times because everyone else does. And humans are deeply uncomfortable doing things differently from everyone else. Medieval people felt this way. We feel this way. The meal schedule persists, not because it's optimal, but because it's collective. Shared. A thing we all do together without thinking about it much. I'm going to tell you one more story, and then I'm going to let you drift off to sleep, if you haven't already. This story is about a woman named Eleanor who lived in 15th century London. Eleanor was a merchant's wife, which meant she was comfortably middle class by medieval standards. Not wealthy, but not poor. She had a cook, which was a mark of status, but just one cook, which meant she wasn't noble. Eleanor's day was structured around meals in ways that would be familiar to you. She woke early, around 6. She did not eat breakfast, though she probably had some bread and ale while getting dressed, because everyone did this and pretended they hadn't. Around 11, dinner was prepared and served. This was the main meal. Multiple courses. The whole household ate together. It took about an hour, maybe longer if there were guests. After dinner, Eleanor handled household business. She met with tradespeople. She supervised servants. She worked on accounts. She did all the administrative work of running a household, which was considerable. Around 6 in the evening, supper was served. This was lighter than dinner, but still substantial. Bread, cheese, some leftover meat from dinner, soup. The household ate together again. After supper, the day was essentially over. Candles were expensive, so once darkness fell, there wasn't much to do except talk by firelight or go to bed. Most nights, Eleanor was in bed by 8 or 9. She'd sleep until 6, wake up, and do it all again. The meal schedule was the framework on which her entire day hung. Now, imagine Eleanor somehow transported to today. Imagine her in a modern city, with a modern job, with all the technology and convenience we take for granted. What would surprise her about our eating habits? Some things would be familiar. We still eat 3 times a day, like she did. We still gather for dinner, like she did. We still have breakfast foods and dinner foods, and social rules about appropriate eating behavior. She'd recognize the basic pattern immediately, but the details would shock her. We eat breakfast openly, without shame, and we consider it virtuous rather than sinful. We've moved dinner to evening, which she'd find very strange indeed. Who wants to eat a huge meal right before bed? We eat lunch at work instead of going home, which would seem lonely and sad to her. We eat alone much more than she ever did, because our households are smaller and our schedules less synchronized. Most of all, she'd be shocked by how much choice we have and how little we use it. We could eat anything anytime, but we don't. We eat the same breakfast at the same time every morning. We eat lunch at noon because everyone else does. We eat dinner at 6 or 7 because that's when dinner happens. We have infinite options, and we choose to follow roughly the same schedule she followed, despite living in a completely different world with completely different constraints. Why, she'd ask. Why are you eating like me? You have so much more than I had. So much more freedom, so much more food, so much more flexibility. Why are you following my schedule? And what would we answer? Probably something about convenience, or health, or tradition. But the real answer is simpler and stranger. Because we've always done it this way. Because 3 meals a day feels normal. Because changing would be weird. Because medieval patterns, once established, are remarkably hard to break. Eleanor would probably shrug and help herself to your refrigerator, eating whenever she wanted. Because medieval people didn't want to follow the meal schedule either. They just had less choice about it. So there you have it. 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A schedule we inherited from medieval monks and peasants, preserved through centuries of social change, rationalized with whatever justification fit the era. We've modernized the food, changed the locations, shifted the times slightly. But the basic pattern remains the same. 3 meals. Same times each day. Don't skip them. Don't question them. This is how eating works. Is it the best way to eat? Maybe for some people. Probably not for everyone. But it's the way we've agreed to eat, collectively, as a society. It's the meal schedule we all know and follow and teach our children. It's medieval thinking, preserved in modern packaging, still governing our daily lives centuries after the people who invented it are dust. And tomorrow, you'll wake up, and without thinking about it much, you'll follow this schedule again. Breakfast at breakfast time, lunch at lunchtime, dinner at dinner time. The same pattern that Eleanor followed in 15th century London. The same pattern that Geoffrey followed in his 14th century village. The same pattern that monks followed in their 12th century monasteries, though they'd be horrified to know we're eating breakfast now. You'll follow this pattern because everyone else does. Because it's familiar. Because changing would be complicated and strange. Because medieval patterns, once established, last forever. We've preserved their meal schedule perfectly, even as we've abandoned almost everything else about their way of life. Medieval people tried very hard to control when and how people ate. They created elaborate rules and justifications and social pressures. They tied eating to morality, to status, to spiritual worth. They made mealtimes into a form of social discipline. And it worked. Centuries later, we're still following their schedule. Still eating at the times they ate, in the patterns they established. We've changed the reasons why, but we haven't changed the what or the when. Their control over our eating habits has outlasted their civilization, outlasted their worldview, outlasted everything about medieval society, except this one pattern. So the next time you eat a meal, any meal at its designated time, take a moment to appreciate the weight of history you're carrying. You're not just eating food, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. to medieval monks trying to prove their devotion, and medieval peasants trying to survive, and medieval nobles trying to demonstrate their status. You're following rules created by people who believed disease was caused by bad air, and bathing was dangerous, and the earth was at the center of the universe. They were wrong about almost everything. But their meal schedule, that we kept, that we preserved perfectly, that we follow faithfully, day after day, without ever really thinking about why. Medieval rules we still follow for no reason. 3 meals a day, at 3 designated times in 3 established categories: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. An arbitrary schedule created by people who lived in a completely different world, preserved by people who live in ours. And now you know. And you'll probably follow the schedule anyway. Because that's what everyone does. Because changing would be weird. Because sometimes the medieval way is just the way things are done. And that's all the reason we need. Sleep well. Dream of pottage and ale, and church bells ringing to mark the hours of the day. And tomorrow, when you wake up, don't eat breakfast immediately. Wait a decent interval. The monks would appreciate it, even if you don't remember why you're doing it. Good night.